Hi, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. In the first part of this video, I talked about what it means in the opening part of the Shema, where Moses, through God's inspiration, says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone." Now I want to move to the second part of the Shema and then talk a little bit about how the Shema then reverberates through the rest of Deuteronomy to give us a sense of what it is the expected response of God's people to God's acts of grace in the Exodus and in the giving of the law. And that central response is going to be faithfulness or faithful obedience, which is going to be rooted in a whole person commitment to the Lord as not just as our God, but as our only God. And that has profound implications for how we live our lives in the world. But let's hear the second part of the Shema, often called the Great Commandment. You will love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And you can go to the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and see how they quote from this Old Testament scriptures. And you'll have some differences in terms of whether it says heart, soul. Sometimes they'll throw mind in, and strength. And it's because these terms have some confusion when we move from Hebrew, the original Hebrew, into Greek, which is what the New Testament would have been written in, and now even in English. And typically when we understand and we think about these words, oftentimes we divide a human person into sections. So frequently this ends up being taught. We have our heart, our soul, and our strength. So you sort of get that emotional part of the human person, which is a lot of times when we talk about heart in the modern world we're getting at, our soul, a spiritual part of ourselves, and then our strength, our physical body, our abilities and such. And this is a typical interpretation of what it means to love the Lord your God, or at least what we're supposed to love the Lord our God with. And I'm going to suggest to you that this is a wrong understanding, in that it misunderstands the meaning of the Hebrew, that in fact the Shema is even more radical than this. But before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and erase this. I want to look also at the word love, because that can have some misunderstandings as well. It's involved in that. What does it mean to love the Lord our God? Or in this case, notice that the language of Deuteronomy goes from a first person plural, the Lord is our God, communal, to now it's a singular, you will love the Lord your God, singular. So now it moves from talking about the whole. Now each person is going to respond to God's grace with individually. This is a critical piece. And what does it mean to love? We can think all of the connotations that the word love has in the modern world. This is a term that gets linked back to the covenant, and scholars have demonstrated that this kind of language often goes into covenants. And essentially what it has to do with is commitment. Commit yourself. So it's not just love in the sense that I can be in love one day and then I fall out of love the next day. This is about making a commitment. So God is calling God's people not to have a mushy-gushy feelings of romantic affection for the Lord, but instead to respond to God's grace with a commitment that each and every day, moment by moment, I'm going to walk faithfully to this one who has invited me into this covenant relationship with. And so love is about commitment, and ultimately it's going to be about commitment to the covenant. So these words, commitment, faithfulness, these are all appropriate ways of talking about what it means to love God. And now let's look at those words, and let's talk about that. The first word is heart. This is the Hebrew word lev or levav. And heart isn't about emotions per se, like we often think, I love you with all my heart. Instead, what heart means in Hebrew is the heart was thought to be the center of a person's volitional center, their thought center, their will. So in essence, what Deuteronomy is actually calling for a person to do is to be fully committed to the Lord with what? Their will, their brain, their thinking power, their plans, their goals. That's pretty radical right there. And in fact, if you think about, as Wesleys, we think about Christian perfection or holiness, and we think about what John Wesley thought about what sin was properly so called. Wesley talked about sin being an intentional violation of a known law of God. It gets back to intentions. So at the heart of Deuteronomy is a radical commitment of God that my will, my intentions, my purposes, my thinking, my thoughts are going to align with God's will. So to love the Lord your God with all your heart, that's a huge piece. And friends, if we could just do that, in a sense, we would be seriously committed to God's purposes. So that's why this isn't just a piece that you pull out of a person. This is the center of the person. And this leads us to our next word, which is soul. And as you might guess, I'm going to suggest that this isn't exactly the perfect translation. This is the Hebrew word nephesh. And nephesh doesn't refer to soul as in the sense of what you could, a spiritual part you can pull out of a person. Nephesh is the whole person. An embodied soul, the whole person. So when we talk about saving a soul, if we mean that whole person, that's the appropriate use of the word. It's not this kind of invisible angel-like thing that we sometimes see in popular culture. It is the person, including the physical body. So capture the power of that now. Deuteronomy is saying respond to God's grace with all of your intentions. Line up your intentionality with God, but also line up everything that makes you, you. That's what a nephesh is. Each one of us, our bodies, our brain, all the energy that comes out of our brain, our thoughts, our DNA, all of that's the nephesh. So in a sense, when we've gotten out to this second layer, we're at 100%. Because what more is there to a person than what exactly they are, which is a soul, a nephesh. But that's when Deuteronomy makes this fun part. It says, traditionally in our translations, all your strength. That isn't the physical part. The word for strength in Hebrew is me'od. And so what this word means in Hebrew is, in most places, it's an adverb. In other words, it means very or very much. So in a sense, if we want to do a literal wooden translation, we could translate this as, you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your very much. So what's going on here? You know, we've already hit 100% at the soul. This is where it's actually God is calling for total devotion. So it's not that this, again, is a person can be divided into three pieces. Instead, it's more radical than that. You've already got to 100% when we give, when we commit ourselves fully with all that we are, all of our gifts, all of our talents, all of our passions, our thoughts, our intentions, our will, our heart, and our soul. But then it's more. It's like we're giving, if you want to think of a sports metaphor, we're talking about giving 110%. And so what this ultimately asks us when we have a Shema faith, when we de-elevate all the other gods in our lives and make God, Yahweh, the God alone, is this invites us to ask ourselves this: am I all in? You will love the Lord your God with all that you are. You know, am I on? This is the call that Moses gives to Israel as a way to live out their response of faithful obedience to God. And so what I want you to see is this is relational. This is about commitment. This is about a commitment to God who relates to us through the covenant. And Deuteronomy goes on from from here to talk about this. As you read through Deuteronomy, I want to show you one of my favorite texts. We'll skip ahead to chapter 10 and listen to some of these words that get added into this. We've had the language of love, which is the language of commitment. Chapter 10, verses 12 and 13. So now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? In other words, what does God require in response to the grace that he's poured out to us? Now listen to these words. Only to fear him or revere the Lord your God, walk in all his ways, love him, serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments of the Lord your God and his decrees I am commanding you today for your own well-being. Again, to look at that language, we have the language of love here. Chapter 10, verses 12 to 13 adds fear, walk, serve, keep, and another word that you see when you read through Deuteronomy, it's not in chapter 10, will be this word cling. Notice these are all relational words that essentially assume that we're in this moment-by-moment relationship with God. And so God has done these great things for Israel. They're poised to go into the promised land. God does give them these legal materials. We look back in Exodus and Leviticus at the legal materials that God has given. Deuteronomy is a second telling of that. And so essentially you get chapters 6 through 11 is our exhortations to faithfulness to the Lord that love God. And then chapters 12 to 26 in Deuteronomy are the specific laws that Moses reminds God's people of them before they go into the promised land. But all this assumes that Israel saying yes to God. And so Deuteronomy chapter 30 includes an invitation to God. And if there's ever been any doubt that law is about God's grace, you can see it in Deuteronomy 30, where in a sense Moses kind of gives an altar call. He's saying, look, you've heard all this stuff. Now what are you going to do about it? Are you going to how are you going to respond to God? And so listen to chapter 30 and listen to this language. Chapter 30, verse 15. See, I've set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. So the laws are to give Israel life. God's inviting them to life. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I'm commanding you today by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways, and observing his commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you do not hear, but are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them, in other words, Yahweh is not Yahweh alone, I declare to you today that you shall perish and you will not live long in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I've set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now what's God want? He says choose life. Choose life. God is coming to covenant relationship with God's people. Israel is God's missional people that God has called to embody his ethic, his values for the sake of all the nations. So he desperately needs Israel to be all in so that when the nations encounter God's people, they can encounter something about what God is like. They're a missional community. And what does God want Israel to do? God doesn't want Israel to disobey and ultimately then mess up the mission by pointing to other gods. God wants Israel to choose life, to choose a life of faithfulness, trusting that God has their best interests at heart and has invited them into the true human life. That's what law is ultimately about. So choose life that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him and holding fast to him. For that means life to you in length of days, so that you may live in the land the Lord swore to give to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So when we read law, it's not about what Israel has to do to gain God's love. Law is, faithful obedience is Israel's response to God's grace. So when we live out a certain ethos or an ethic as missional people today, we're not doing it so that we gain access to God's grace. We're doing it as our response to grace so that the way that we live our lives, how we order our lives, how we love God, love neighbor, take care of creation, that points other persons who don't yet know God to the one true God, the one who's truly worthy of our faithful obedience and of our full allegiance. And that's ultimately what a missional community is. We point to the Creator. Again, I'm Brian Russell. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.